The first time Isle understood what her gift truly meant, she was 9 years old and standing in the kitchen corridor while the head cook dismissed a servant for stealing bread. The servant had not stolen anything. Isle knew it the way she knew when rain was coming, not from the sky, but from something that settled in the back of her throat, a scent that had no name in any language she had been taught. The cook's accusation smelled of convenience. The servant's fear smelled of truth. She had told Petra afterward, quietly, the way she told Petra everything. "Say nothing," Petra had said, not unkindly. "Not here, not ever, if you can help it." Isle had learned to help it. For 13 years, she had helped it. The pack of Aldrich and Vespera occupied a territory of stone and cold wind, a sprawling holding of gray walls and older grudges built into the side of a ridge that faced north and never caught the afternoon sun. Isle had grown up within those walls after her parents died of fever when she was 4. Too young to remember their faces clearly, old enough to remember the specific weight of being unwanted. Petra had taken her in without ceremony or explanation, had given her a corner of her own quarters and taught her which herbs cleaned wounds and which ones worsened them, and had never once suggested that Isle owed her anything for it. What Isle owed her, she had decided herself. It was not a debt. It was the kind of loyalty that does not require naming. She worked in the lower castle. Laundry in the mornings, firewood stacking in the late afternoon, whatever the housekeeper decided needed doing in between. The work was physical and repetitive, and she had made her peace with it a long time ago. What she had not made peace with, what she suspected she never would, was the smell of this place in recent months. Something was wrong with Aldrich. She had noticed it first in the late autumn, when the air inside the great hall began carrying a faint bitterness that had no business being there. Aldrich was a large man, still broad across the shoulders despite his 45 years, with gray-streaked hair and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to command. His scent had always been what she expected of an alpha, deep, settled, the kind of presence that communicated stability without effort. Even standing still, there was a pressure to him the room obeyed, a dominance that wasn't politics so much as biology, old as teeth. Now it carried something underneath, something that did not belong. Isle knew poisons the way she knew herbs, because Petra had taught her both. The bitterness she detected in Aldrich's scent was not illness. Illness had its own signature, fevered and urgent, like metal left in rain. This was slower, more deliberate. The particular chemical signature of something being introduced repeatedly in small amounts, patient as rot. She said nothing for 6 weeks. She watched, she catalogued. She told herself she was not certain, that she could be wrong, that she had been wrong before about smaller things. She was not wrong about this. She told Petra on a night when the wind was loud enough to cover voices, sitting on the edge of Petra's narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap. Petra listened without interrupting. When Isle finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. Her green eyes moved to the single candle on the table and stayed there. "How long?" Petra asked. "Since before the first frost. Maybe longer, and I only caught it recently." "And you're certain it's not a natural sickness?" "I'm certain." Petra nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she was thinking several things at once and had decided to only say one of them. "Then we say nothing." "Not yet. He's getting worse." "I know." Petra rose from the bed and moved to the small chest she kept beneath the window. "Which is why I need you to say nothing while I do what I should have done 2 months ago." Isle watched her open the chest. Beneath folded cloth and dried bundles of herbs, there was a space that Isle had never looked into closely. Petra withdrew a small stoppered bottle, dark glass, no label, and set it on the table beside the candle. "I've been collecting what I could," Petra said. "Residue from the preparation room, records I copied from the supply ledger before they were altered." She looked at Isle directly. "I need more time to make this into something that cannot be dismissed. Do you understand?" "You've known." "I've suspected. Suspicion without proof is a death sentence for someone like me." Petra stoppered the bottle again and wrapped it in cloth. "For someone like you, it's worse." Isle understood. An Omega with no family, no standing, no wolf powerful enough to make her worth protecting. An accusation against her would not require much evidence. It would only require someone with enough authority to make it. She kept quiet. She kept her head down. She moved through the castle's lower corridors and did her work and did not look at Vespera any longer than courtesy required. Vespera was 35 and had been Luna Queen of this pack for 8 years. She was the kind of woman who occupied space in a room not through loudness, but through the particular quality of her attention. Always watching, always calculating, always 3 conversations ahead of whoever she was speaking to. Her hair was the dark red of old garnets. Her eyes were the color of river mud and twice as opaque. Isle had never trusted her. She had also never given her reason to look twice in her direction. That changed on a morning in early winter. Isle had been carrying water from the eastern well when she encountered a guard near the lower hall. One of Aldrich's personal guard, a man named Hune, who had served the Alpha for more than a decade. He looked wrong, not injured, confused in the way that people looked when they had been told something that rearranged everything they thought they knew, and had not yet decided what to do with it. She should have walked past him. She knew she should have. The smell coming off him was not just confusion. It was the specific sharp edge of someone preparing to act, and act badly, out of panic, in a direction that would not help. "Whatever you're thinking of doing," she said quietly, stopping beside him. "Wait." Hune looked at her. "You don't know what I'm thinking. I know you're frightened. I know it's about him." She did not say Aldrich's name. "And I know that acting right now, today without proof, will only make it worse for him." She said it quickly and walked away before he could respond. She did not see who was standing at the end of the corridor. She found out 2 hours later, when the housekeeper came to find her with an expression that had all the warmth of a stone floor. Vespera had her brought to the great hall at midday when it was fullest. The hall smelled of torch smoke and the particular tension of a crowd that had been assembled rather than gathered. People who were present because they had been told to be, not because they wanted to witness anything. Aldrich was there, seated at the high table. He looked diminished in a way that hurt to see, still broad, still upright, but with a fragility underneath that had not been there 6 months ago. His eyes found Isle when she was brought forward, and she thought she saw something in them that might have been recognition, or might have been apology. Vespera stood at the center of the hall. "This Omega," Vespera said, with the measured calm of someone who had prepared these words in advance and was now simply delivering them, "has been heard spreading dangerous falsehoods about the health of our Alpha. She has been observed in unsanctioned conversation with members of his personal guard. She has attempted to introduce fear and mistrust into this pack's most critical relationships." Isle kept her hands still at her sides. The accusations smelled the way accusations always smelled when they had been constructed rather than discovered. Too clean, too complete, with none of the rough edges that genuine grievances carried. She looked for Petra in the crowd and did not find her. "The penalty for deliberate destabilization of pack hierarchy," Vespera continued, "is exile to the outer forest." A sound moved through the crowd. Not protest, something more complicated than that. The kind of sound that a group of people made when they knew something was wrong, but had already calculated that saying so would cost more than they were willing to pay. Aldrich said nothing. He was watching Vespera with an expression Isle could not fully read from where she stood. Not approval, not disagreement, just a terrible stillness that might have been exhaustion or might have been the particular helplessness of a man whose body was being stolen from him increment by increment. Isle caught the faint metallic sweetness on his breath. Whatever Vespera had been dosing him with left him slow in public, and any open defiance would have been turned into evidence that he was unstable, unfit. Isle did not beg. She had decided that before she was brought into the hall, in the 2 hours between the housekeeper's visit and this moment, begging would accomplish nothing, and it would cost her something she intended to keep. "She will be taken to the edge of the outer forest at dusk," Vespera said. "What happens after is the forest's business." The outer forest was not simply wild territory. Every person in that hall knew what lived there, wolves that had broken from all pack structure, feral and territorial, and entirely without the restraint that hierarchy imposed. Being thrown into it was not technically an execution. It simply relied on the forest to accomplish what an execution would have. Isle was taken to a side room to wait out the remaining hours of the day. She sat on the floor with her back against the cold stone wall and thought about Petra. Not where she was, but whether she had understood in time to do what needed doing. Whether the bottle and the ledger records were somewhere safe. Whether the old woman had been smart enough to run before anyone thought to look for her. Petra was the most careful person Isle had ever known. She had to trust that. At dusk, 2 guards walked her to the tree line. The outer forest began where the torchlight ended, a wall of dark and cold, and the distant sound of movement that had no interest in being quiet. One of the guards almost said something when they stopped. She saw it on his face, the beginning of an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. He swallowed it. They left her there. Isle stood at the edge of the trees for a moment. The ferals did not attack immediately. That was the thing about creatures that had abandoned pack structure entirely. They had lost the discipline of coordinated assault, but they had kept the patience of hunters. They circled first, tested, waited to understand what they were dealing with before committing to anything that might cost them. Isle understood this because she could smell their intentions before their bodies moved to carry them out. It was not a precise language. It translated more as pressure than as words, a tightening in the air when attention sharpened into hunger, a loosening when uncertainty crept in. She had spent years learning to read it without letting on that she could. And now, alone in the dark between the trees with blood drying on her left forearm from a branch she had not seen in time, that reading was the only advantage she had. She moved carefully, not running. Running triggered pursuit in things that were built to chase. She moved the way she had learned to move through the castle when she wanted to be overlooked, steadily, without urgency, taking up as little space as possible. The first night was the worst. She found a section of ground between 2 large roots that offered partial cover on 3 sides and spent the hours until dawn with her back against the wood, tracking the movement of the ferals by their scent. 3 of them circled her position at varying distances. One came close enough that she could hear its breathing. She held still and let her awareness expand outward, reading the shape of its intention. And when she felt the particular shift that preceded a decision to act, she made a sound. Low, controlled, the specific frequency that communicated neither fear nor aggression, but something in between that the most basic animal instinct interpreted as uncertain territory. The feral stopped, reconsidered, moved away. She did not sleep. By the second day, she had found a pattern to their movement and was using it to navigate. The ferals held loose territories even without formal pack structure. There were boundaries between them, invisible but chemically real. And the spaces between those boundaries were comparatively safer. She moved through the gaps. Her arm had stopped bleeding but was stiffening in the cold. She had torn a strip from the hem of her dress and wrapped it, which helped less than she would have liked. She was thirsty and had found a narrow stream running between mossy stones that she drank from without stopping to question it, because the alternative was worse. On the afternoon of the second day, she found the ruins. They were old enough that the forest had begun the process of reclaiming them, walls reduced to knee-height in places, the floor buried under decades of leaf fall and moss. What remained of a roof over one corner was more gap than cover, but the 3 standing walls created a space that the ferals had apparently decided was not worth investigating. The scent inside was old and undisturbed. She settled into the corner where 2 walls still met at full height and allowed herself, finally, to rest. She was still there when she heard the horses. The sound came from the north, hoofbeats on ground that had not been softened by the density of trees, moving at a pace that suggested a group that was not lost and was not rushing. She heard voices, too low to make out words, but carrying the particular cadence of men accustomed to giving and receiving information without ceremony. Isle pressed herself against the wall and listened. The horses slowed, stopped. Then a different sound, lighter footsteps, a single person moving through the undergrowth with more care and deliberateness than the others. A tracker, she thought. Someone following something specific. She smelled him before she heard him get close. The scent was alpha. Unmistakably, overwhelmingly alpha, in a way that was qualitatively different from Aldrich even at his strongest. It was not aggressive. It was simply present in the way that a very large thing was present, the way that weather was present, filling whatever space it occupied without effort or intention. Underneath it was something she could not immediately categorize, something that the back of her mind responded to before the front of it had time to form an opinion. She stayed still. He came through the gap in the wall where the doorway had been and stopped when he saw her. He was tall. She registered that first, and then the breadth of him, and then the specific quality of his attention as it moved across the space and settled on her with the focused stillness of someone who had learned to assess situations before acting on them. Dark hair, a beard kept short and close, a scar running horizontal across his left jaw that caught the fading afternoon light. His eyes were green and very direct. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she registered what was behind her own ribs. A warmth that had no business being there, sudden and sourceless, like stepping from shadow into sunlight. It confused her. She catalogued it and set it aside because there were more immediate concerns. "There are 2 ferals within 100 yards of this position," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "On your left side, both of them. One has been tracking the sound of your horses for the last quarter hour." The man looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. "You can tell that from here." "Yes." He turned his head slightly, and she understood he was processing the information rather than dismissing it. He made a short gesture with one hand, something directed at whoever was outside the walls, and she heard the group's movement adjust in response. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "Are you injured?" She glanced at her arm. "Functionally." He crossed the space between them in a few measured steps and crouched to look at the makeshift bandage without touching it. Up close, the alpha scent was more complex. She could read things in it that she had not caught from a distance. Discipline. A fatigue he was not showing on his face. And underneath both of those, threading through the rest in a way she had no framework to explain, that same thing she had felt in her own chest. Present in him, too, responding to her proximity the way a compass responded to north. She did not understand it. She did not have time to examine it. "We need to move before the light goes," he said, straightening. "There's a camp half a mile north, outside the forest boundary. I'm not going anywhere with someone whose name I don't know." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to acknowledgement. "Calder," he said. The name landed differently than names usually did. She had heard it before. The Alpha King, the highest authority in the shifter world, the name that other alphas used the way common people use the names of things they did not entirely believe in until they encountered them directly. She looked at him again, with that information placed over what she had already observed, and found that it fit. It fit in the way that explanations fit when they were correct rather than convenient. "I'll," she said. He nodded once and moved toward the doorway. She followed, because her alternatives had narrowed considerably over the past 2 days, and she was practical enough to recognize it. Outside the ruins, 4 men waited with horses. A guard reduced enough in number to move quickly, large enough to discourage interference. One of them, broad-shouldered with light hair and an honest face, looked between her and Calder with an expression that was carefully neutral in the specific way that meant he was thinking something he had chosen not to say yet. Calder turned to face his men before they moved. "She is under my protection." His voice carried the particular quality of a statement that was not an announcement, but a fact being placed into the record. "She rides with us." The light-haired man, she would learn later his name was Doran, held Calder's gaze for a fraction of a second before he nodded. The others followed without comment. They both knew what they were, what they could do if they let the animal take the reins. But not here, not behind stone walls that carried sound, and not under eyes that would call a shift monstrosity only when it benefited them. Isle was given a horse and helped to mount, because her arm made it difficult, and she was not too proud to accept the assistance. Calder rode at the front without looking back at her, which she found she preferred to being watched. They cleared the forest boundary before full dark. The camp was small and efficiently arranged, fires positioned to give warmth without excess visibility, supplies organized for fast movement, the kind of setup that spoke of people who had done this many times and saw no reason to add ceremony to function. A healer's kit was produced for her arm without her asking. She cleaned and re-wrapped the wound herself, seated near one of the fires, and was aware throughout of Doran watching her with the particular attention of someone building a theory. She ignored him and ate what was given to her, because she had not eaten in 2 days and her body had stopped being subtle about that fact. Later, when most of the camp had settled, Doran sat down across the fire from her. "How long were you in there?" he asked. 2 days. Alone. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved between them. "You gave us accurate information about the Pharaoh's positions, before you could have seen them." She had been waiting for this, or something like it. "Yes, that's not a standard Omega ability." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Doran looked at her with the expression of a man revising something, not suspicious, recalibrating. "He's not going to say anything tonight," he said, nodding in the direction Calder had gone. "But you should know that what he said back there, about protection, that's not something he says lightly." Isle looked at the fire. "I don't know him well enough to know what he says lightly." "That's fair." Doran stood, brushing dirt from his knee. "You will, though." "Know him, I mean." He said it simply, without weight, as if it were already a settled thing. Then he walked away before she could decide how to respond. Isle sat with the fire for a long while after that. Her arm ached. The warmth in her chest that she had catalogued and set aside in the ruins was still there, quieter now, but present. It pulled at bone and breath, sharp and undeniable, the kind of claim that made a body react before it could decide to be polite about it. She examined it more carefully in the dark, turning it over the way she would turn over an unfamiliar herb, trying to identify it by what it was, not by what she hoped or feared it might be. She did not reach a conclusion that night. She only knew that when she finally lay down and closed her eyes, the forest felt very far away, and the sound of the camp settling into sleep felt, against her better judgment, like something she might learn to trust. On the road to the capital, Petra stayed in Isle's mind with the persistence of a wound you couldn't stop checking. Isle asked no direct questions. She had learned early what questions cost in the wrong company, but she listened. At every camp, at every stop, she read the edges of conversations the way she read weather, searching for the smallest sign that Petra had survived the fallout of the hall. When she found nothing, she did not let herself name it as loss. Not yet. The capital took Isle by surprise. She had built a version of it in her mind during the 4 days of travel, something like Aldrich's Holding but larger, the same gray stone and narrow corridors scaled up to fit a king's authority. What she found instead was a city that had grown outward rather than upward, spreading across a wide river valley with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed walls to feel secure. The castle itself sat at the valley's northern edge, built into the rock face rather than on top of it, so that the stone of the building and the stone of the ridge became indistinguishable at the upper levels. It smelled different from anything she had known. Larger packs carried more complex scent signatures, more individuals, more history, more layers of hierarchy compressed into a single territory. She spent the first hours simply breathing it in, cataloging without meaning to, the way her gift operated when she stopped trying to direct it. She was given a room in the castle's eastern corridor, not servants' quarters. She noted that without comment. A room with a window that faced the valley, a bed with actual weight to its blankets, a basin for washing. She stood in the center of it for a longer moment than was probably necessary before she sat down on the bed and allowed herself to feel how tired she was. Calder did not seek her out that first day, or the second. She saw him at a distance twice, once crossing the main courtyard with Doran and 2 men she did not recognize. Once at the far end of a corridor where he stopped to speak with someone and did not look up. Both times the warmth in her chest registered his proximity before her eyes found him, which she continued to find deeply inconvenient. What she found instead, on the 3rd day, was Oswin. He came to her room in the morning with the manner of someone performing a courtesy they had already decided was unnecessary. He was perhaps 40, with hair that had gone gray at the temples in a way that looked calculated rather than natural, and eyes that moved across everything in a room before settling on any individual thing. "The king has asked that you be comfortable during your stay," he said from the doorway. He had not been invited in and had not asked. "I wanted to introduce myself. Oswin, I serve as senior counsel to His Majesty." "I know who you are," Isle said. She had asked Doran about the court structure on the 2nd day of travel. Oswin smiled. It reached the correct parts of his face. Then you'll understand that my concern is the stability of this court and the relationships that sustain it. Your presence here is—" He paused, selecting the word with visible care. "Complicated. I imagine it is. The Pack of Vespera is a significant territory. The Alpha King's refusal to negotiate your return creates friction that will need to be managed." He looked at her with the expression of someone who believed they were being generous. "I only want you to understand the position you've placed His Majesty in." Isle considered him. His scent was cautious and deliberate, with the particular undertone of someone who had spent so long managing outcomes that they had forgotten what an unconstructed emotion felt like. He was not lying. He was also not telling her everything he thought. "Thank you for explaining it," she said. He left. She sat with the conversation afterward and noted it carefully, the way Petra had taught her to note things, not with alarm, but with attention. She thought about Petra often in those first weeks. Every morning she woke expecting to find some word, and every morning there was none. She did not let herself follow the thought to its darkest conclusions. Petra was careful. Petra had survived this pack and this Luna Queen for longer than Isle had been alive. She had to trust that. 3 weeks after Isle's arrival, Doran came to find her in the early afternoon with a different quality to his expression than usual. "There's someone at the eastern gate asking for you," he said. An older woman, traveling alone. Isle was on her feet before he finished. Petra looked as though she had been walked through a great deal of difficult country, which she had. There was a cut above her left ear that had healed badly, and a grayness to her skin that came from sustained exhaustion rather than illness. And she was carrying a pack that Isle would later discover held the glass bottle, the copied ledger records, and almost nothing else. Isle did not embrace her in the courtyard with Doran watching. She waited until they were inside, in the corridor, and then she put both arms around the old woman's shoulders and held on for a moment that she did not count. "I was followed for the first 4 days," Petra said, when Isle released her. "I took the river route west to lose the scent trail, then came north. It added time. Vespera sent trackers. 2 of them. They stopped at the river." Petra's green eyes moved to Doran, assessing him with the directness she applied to everything. "They didn't cross into the king's territory. Even Vespera has limits, apparently." Doran introduced himself. Petra handed him the pack without ceremony. "That needs to reach the king without being opened by anyone else first," she said. "I assume you're someone who can manage that." "I am," Doran said. He looked mildly surprised by her, which Isle found privately satisfying. Calder examined the contents of the pack that evening, with Doran present. Isle was summoned the following morning and asked to explain the context of each item: the bottle, the records, the timeline of what she had observed in Aldrich's deterioration. She did so precisely and without embellishment, seated across a table from Calder in a room that served as his working study. It was the most she had spoken in his presence since the forest. He listened the way she had noticed he did most things, with his full attention directed at the information rather than at his own response to it, asking questions only when something needed clarification. "The records show 3 purchases of restricted herb compounds," he said when she finished. "All routed through a secondary supplier in the Southern Territories, all within the past year. Consistent with the timeline of what I detected," Isle said. He looked at her across the table. The warmth that the bond produced was a constant presence now. She had stopped being surprised by it and had started simply acknowledging it the way she acknowledged weather. It was there. It was not the same as trust, and she was not going to confuse the two. "I want to validate what you can do," Calder said. "Not because I doubt it. Because what you've brought me will be challenged, and if your testimony is part of what supports it, I need it to be unimpeachable." "A demonstration," Isle said. "With witnesses I select." She thought about it for a moment. Not whether to agree, but what it would mean to agree. It would make her ability visible in a way it had never been before. That door, once opened, did not close. "Who?" she asked. "Doran. Petra. 2 betas whose loyalty I've tested over 10 years. He paused. "Not Oswin." The deliberate exclusion of Oswin told her something about what Calder already suspected. She nodded. The demonstration took place the following afternoon in the study, with the 5 witnesses Calder had named seated in a loose arrangement around the room. No ceremony, No announcement of what was about to happen beyond a brief explanation from Calder that was factual and plain. Isle stood at the center of the room and let her gift open fully, which she had not done voluntarily in years. It felt like releasing a breath she had been holding for longer than she could remember. She worked through each person in the room systematically. She described what she detected, not invented specifics, but the genuine emotional and intentional signatures that each person carried. With the first beta, she identified a worry he was managing about something external to this room, something ongoing. He confirmed it, quietly, without detail. With the second, she caught the particular sharp edge of someone who had recently made a decision they were not entirely at peace with. He looked at the floor and said nothing, which was its own confirmation. With Doran, she paused. He was watching her with the careful interest of someone who was also, at the same moment, watching Calder's reaction to her. "You already know what I'll find in you," she said to Doran. "Probably," he agreed. She turned to Petra last. Petra's scent was familiar. She had known it since childhood, could read it the way she could read her own handwriting. She did not narrate it. She only met the old woman's eyes and saw the slight softening there that meant Petra was satisfied. Then, she made herself look at Calder. She had avoided reading him directly since the forest. The bond complicated it in ways she did not fully understand. She could not be certain where his emotional signature ended and her own response to him began. But she looked now, carefully, with the specific focus she used when she needed accuracy over comfort. What she found was not simple. There was the discipline she had catalogued before, genuine, deeply habitual, the kind that came from years of being the person in the room who could not afford to react before thinking. There was the fatigue. There was something that she classified after a moment as conviction, not the performed certainty of someone who needed others to believe in them, but the quieter kind that existed regardless of audience. And underneath all of it, responding to her attention with an immediacy that he controlled but could not entirely conceal, that same thing she had been carrying in her own chest since the ruins. She looked away before she catalogued it further. "Well," said the first beta, after a silence. "Yes," Doran said mildly, as if that answered something. Calder dismissed the witnesses with a few words, and they filed out. Petra was the last to leave, and she touched Isle's arm once as she passed, brief and light, the way she communicated things she did not put into words. When the room was empty, Calder remained at the table. "Vespera sent emissaries this morning," he said, "formally requesting your return and Petra's arrest as a fugitive." "What did you say?" "No." He said it without elaboration, the way he seemed to say most things that he had already decided. "She will push further. I want you to know that before it happens." Isle looked at him across the table. The warmth between them was steady and unhurried, patient in a way that she found both easier and harder to manage than urgency would have been. "I know," she said. Outside the window, the valley was going gold with late afternoon light. Somewhere in the corridor beyond the study door, she could hear the castle's ordinary sounds, footsteps, voices, the distant rhythm of a place that moved on its own momentum, regardless of what happened in any single room. She thought about Aldrich, still in Vespera's holding, still being diminished by degrees. She thought about what Calder had not said, which was that refusing Vespera's demand had a cost, and that he had paid it anyway. She filed that away with everything else she was learning about him in the place where she kept things that required more time before she knew what to do with them. Calder did not stop it immediately. Not because he failed to notice, nothing this deliberate escaped him, but because he was watching who leaned in, who carried Oswin's suggestions with eager hands, and who kept their distance. The pressure began the way pressure usually did, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of smaller things that were each individually manageable and collectively exhausting. Oswin moved carefully. Isle gave him that. He did not confront Calder directly or make demands that could be cleanly refused. Instead, he worked in the spaces between conversations. A comment here about the political cost of harboring disputed Omegas. A question there about whether the kingdom's resources were best directed toward internal matters rather than external ones. He was always reasonable. He always had a point that could not be entirely dismissed. She knew because she could smell it. the particular chemical trace of someone running a campaign. Patient, incremental, built for endurance rather than speed. She had encountered it before in smaller forms, in the castle of a pack that was not this one, in people who wanted things they could not ask for directly. She told Doran on a morning when the first real cold of the season had settled into the valley, and the courtyard stones were pale with frost. "I know," Doran said. He was leaning against the wall of the corridor with his arms crossed, watching the courtyard through the narrow window. "He's been at it for 10 days. There are 3 betas on the council who are listening. Is Calder aware? Calder is aware of most things." He glanced at her. He lets situations develop until they show him what they actually are. It's a method. It's a risk. "Yes," Doran agreed without apparent concern. "Usually it works." She thought about that for the rest of the morning. The investigation proper began the following week. Calder pulled records from the kingdom's trade archives, documentation of commercial movement through the southern territories over the past 2 years, cross-referenced with the supplier names Petra had identified from the copied ledger. The picture that emerged was not subtle. 3 purchases of restricted compounds, each routed through intermediary accounts that dissolved after the transaction. A pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. Isle was brought into the working sessions not as a witness, but as a participant. She knew the timeline of Aldrich's deterioration in a level of detail that the records alone could not provide, and that detail mattered for establishing intent versus accident. She sat at the table across from Calder and 2 of his trusted betas and answered their questions with the same precision she had used in the demonstration. It was during the 3rd session that the conversation shifted. The betas had stepped out briefly, and she and Calder were alone with the spread of documents between them. He was reading something with the focused stillness she had come to recognize as his default mode of concentration. She was reviewing the timeline she had written out, checking it against the supplier dates. "You've been avoiding the direct question," Calder said, without looking up. Isle did not pretend not to know what he meant. "Which one?" "Why you said anything to the guard, Hune." He set down the document and looked at her. "You had kept it hidden for weeks. You knew the risk. You told Petra to wait. And then you stopped a guard in a corridor and said exactly the kind of thing that gave Vespera what she needed to act against you." It was a fair question. She had asked it herself in the outer forest during the second night when she had nothing to do but think. He was going to do something without proof, she said. Whatever he had in mind, it would have failed and given Vespera cause to remove him. He was loyal to Aldrich. Genuinely. She paused. "I didn't think about what came after. I thought about what was in front of me." Calder was quiet for a moment. "That's not a strategic error," he said finally. "It's a values error. You prioritized the right thing for the wrong timeline." It was the most precisely she had heard anyone describe a mistake of hers in her life. She found she did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. The bond had been a constant presence throughout the investigation. Steady, patient, with the particular quality of something that was not demanding acknowledgement, but was not going to pretend it did not exist either. Sitting across a table from him for hours over several days had made it impossible to maintain the careful distance she had managed in the first weeks. She had learned things about him that she had not expected to learn, in the way that you learn things about people who did not perform for you, who simply worked alongside you and let the working speak. He was precise, without being cold. He asked questions that were inconvenient when they needed to be asked and did not soften them, but he received answers without using them as evidence of weakness. He did not manage her. He did not explain things she had not asked to have explained. She was aware, with an increasing clarity, that she found inconvenient in its own right, that she did not trust many people, and that she was beginning to trust him. She had not resolved what to do with that when the situation resolved itself through other means. The assassin had been in the castle for months. Isle's gift flared, but it wasn't only emotion. There was a predator's edge riding the air, a hot metal tang beneath perfume, the unmistakable stink of intent, the way a wolf smells the moment before the pounce. She understood that afterward, when she had time to trace it. Someone recruited before Isle had ever arrived, positioned as a secondary kitchen worker, unremarkable in every way that mattered for remaining unremarkable. Vespera had placed him there not specifically for Isle, but as a general instrument. the way a careful person kept a tool available without knowing precisely when they would need it. Isle found him on an evening when she was returning from the archive rooms to her own corridor. She did not see him. She smelled the intention before her eyes registered the figure stepping out from the alcove ahead of her, and the sheer specificity of what she detected, focused, cold, directed entirely at her, made her step sideways before she had consciously decided to. The knife went past her arm and hit the wall. She did not scream. She dropped low, put the wall at her back, and did the only thing that made sense in the moment. She opened her voice fully and said, loudly and clearly, "There is a man in the north corridor with a blade." The castle had guards in the corridors after dark. The response was not immediate, but it was fast enough. 2 guards came from the southern end, another from the stairs above. The man ran north and was caught at the stairwell. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall when Calder arrived. He came quickly, not running, but with the compressed energy of someone who had moved as fast as was compatible with arriving functional. He looked at her arm first, which had a shallow cut along the outer edge where the knife had grazed it on its way past. "It's nothing," she said. He crouched in front of her. His expression was doing something that she did not have a precise category for. It was not the focused blankness of his working face, or the careful control of his public one. It was something underneath both of those. "Isle, I'm not injured." The intention shifted before the movement. "I had enough warning." She looked at him steadily. "I'm all right." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before he stood and turned to deal with the guards and the situation, which was now requiring management in several directions simultaneously. The council met the following morning. The assassin had been questioned through the night by Doran, methodically and without theater, and what he had provided was not a complete account, but was enough. The name of who had sent him, the method of contact, the instruction that had been, "Wait, and use your judgment about when." 3 of Oswin's allied betas were present when Doran presented the findings. Isle watched their faces from her position at the edge of the room. The scent that came off them was the specific mixture of people recalibrating their position under time pressure. Not guilt, exactly, but the sudden recognition that a calculation they had made was no longer sound. Oswin's face showed nothing. His scent showed considerably more. He said afterward that he had advocated for a political solution and had not known the extent of Vespera's methods. Isle did not weigh in on whether that was true. It was not her counsel. What she did that evening was go to the room Petra had been given and sit with the old woman in the quiet while the fire worked through its wood and the castle settled into night around them. "He'll ask you something soon," Petra said after a while. Isle looked at the fire. "I know. What will you say?" "I don't know yet." Petra made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism. She reached over and put one dry, warm hand briefly over Isle's. Then she withdrew it and picked up the cup of water on the side table and said nothing further, which was the most Petra-like thing she could have done and which Isle was grateful for. Because the truth was, she could feel what was building between her and Calder the way she felt weather. Not as a thought, but as a physical fact, a pressure in the air that was not unpleasant, but was undeniable. The mate bond had never been subtle. What she had been managing was not the bond itself, but her own response to it. The part of her that had learned, over 22 years in a pack that saw her as peripheral at best, to treat the idea of being chosen as something that happened to other people. She knew he was not Aldrich. She knew he was not Vespera. She knew from weeks of working alongside him and reading him more accurately than she had ever read anyone, that what he was something she did not have a prior template for. That was not the problem. The problem was that knowing something and trusting it were not the same thing, and the distance between them was built from things that predated him entirely. She sat with Petra until the fire burned low, and she thought about what came next, and she did not arrive at a conclusion, only at the recognition that the question was no longer whether something existed between them, but what she intended to do about it. Outside, the valley was dark and cold, and entirely indifferent to her uncertainty. Inside, the fire gave its last light. Somewhere in the castle, Calder was awake. She could tell, the way she could always tell now. the bond carrying his presence like a low note held beneath everything else. She let herself acknowledge it for the first time without immediately setting it aside. Then she banked the fire for Petra and walked back to her own room and lay down in the dark and waited to see what the morning would require of her. The formal summons went out 12 days after the assassination attempt. Calder sent riders to 7 packed territories, each carrying the same message. A hearing before the assembled Alphas convened under the authority of the Alpha King regarding charges of deliberate poisoning of a seated Alpha and conspiracy to murder a protected Omega. The charges required the presence of the accused, 2 neutral witnesses from neighboring packs, and any party with standing to testify. Vespera arrived on the 4th day after the summons, with a retinue that was smaller than her status suggested and larger than was necessary for a woman who claimed to have nothing to hide. She rode into the capital with the particular composure of someone who had decided, on some earlier morning, that composure was the only weapon left available to her and intended to use it completely. Isle watched her arrival from a window above the courtyard. Vespera did not look up. Her scent, even from that distance, was a controlled surface over something that had been burning for weeks. Aldrich arrived the following day. He had been transported by his own remaining loyal guard, the ones who had stayed when the others had shifted allegiance toward Vespera, a smaller number than his rank deserved, but enough to make the journey. He was seated in a covered cart rather than on horseback, which told Isle everything about how much the poison had taken from him. When they helped him down into the courtyard, he stood on his own feet, but carefully, with the specific deliberateness of a man relearning how much he could trust his own body. She went down to the courtyard. She did not plan to. Her feet simply made the decision, and she followed it. He recognized her. She saw it happen, the slight adjustment in his expression when he registered who she was. "Isle," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. "My lord." She paused. "How are you standing?" A sound came from him that might have been a laugh, reduced by exhaustion to something quieter. With considerable effort, he looked at her for a moment with the eyes she remembered. Still sharp, still present. Whatever the poison had taken from his body had not reached there. "I heard what happened. What you tried to do." A pause. "Hune told me. Before I lost the months. I should have found a better way to do it. Probably," he said. "But you were right about what you saw. It was not absolution. She did not need it to be. It was simply the acknowledgement of a fact by the person it had most concerned, and there was a particular weight to that which she carried into the hearing room the following morning. The room Calder had chosen for the hearing was not the great hall. Too large, too ceremonial, too easy for theater to display substance. It was a council chamber with a long stone table, seats for 12, and windows along one wall that let in a flat, honest winter light. The 7 Alphas who had responded to the summons were seated when Isle entered with Doran. The 2 neutral witnesses sat at the table's far end. Vespera was already seated, her hands folded on the table surface, her expression offering nothing. Aldrich sat to Calder's left, which required no explanation. Calder opened the proceedings plainly. He stated the charges, identified the evidence, and explained the structure of what would follow. He did not perform it. He presented it the way he presented everything, as information that the room required in order to function. The evidence came first. Doran presented the trade records, the supplier chain, the dissolved accounts. A beta from the archive gave testimony about the documentation's provenance. Petra spoke about the bottle and the ledger copies she had collected, and about what she had observed in the preparation room over the months preceding Isle's exile. She spoke without hesitation and without embellishment, in the direct, measured way she did everything, and Isle watched the faces of the neutral witnesses and saw them doing what careful people did when they heard testimony that did not have the shape of a lie. Vespera's advocate, a beta she had brought from her own retinue, offered the expected counter-arguments. The records showed purchases, not intent. The bottle's chain of custody was imperfect. The testimony of a runaway Omega and an exiled servant was motivated by self-interest. They were not bad arguments. They were the arguments available to someone whose actual position was weak, deployed with the skill of someone who knew exactly how much weight they could bear. Then Calder indicated Isle. She had thought in the days beforehand about what it would mean to do this publicly. The demonstration in the study had been controlled. known witnesses, a contained space, people who had been prepared. This was different. This was 7 alphas she had never met, 2 neutral parties with no reason to extend her credibility, and Vespera watching from across the table with those opaque brown eyes that gave nothing away. She stood. "My gift," she said, addressing the room without directing it at any single person, "is the ability to read emotional and intentional states through scent. More precisely, I detect what a person is preparing to do and what they feel with a level of accuracy that exceeds standard Omega ability." She paused. "This was demonstrated privately 4 weeks ago before witnesses. I am prepared to demonstrate it again, here, before this body, if that is useful to these proceedings." One of the neutral witnesses, an older alpha from a Western territory with the weathered look of someone who had attended many hearings and been surprised by few of them, leaned forward slightly. "Demonstrate how? Choose any person in this room. Ask me to read them. Ask them afterward whether I was accurate." A brief silence. The Western alpha looked at his counterpart, then at Calder, then back at Isle. "The woman seated third from the left," he said. "One of my own party. I'll verify." Isle looked at the woman. A beta she had not spoken to, had barely observed since entering the room. She opened her gift fully and read the signature carefully. "She's weighing something she heard this morning against something she believed before she arrived," Isle said. "The hearing has shifted her position, but she hasn't decided by how much. There's also something personal, concern about someone who isn't in this room, someone younger." The beta's expression changed in a small but unmistakable way. The Western alpha looked at her. She gave a single nod. The room's quality shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that rooms shifted when something that had been theoretical became concrete. Isle turned finally to Vespera. She had been saving this, not for effect, but because it required more care. The bond's interference was not a factor here. Vespera was simply a difficult read, someone who had spent decades building a surface that she wore so consistently it had begun to feel like a self. But surfaces had edges. Isle had learned to find them. She read carefully, working inward from the outermost layer. "The composure is real," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What I'm reading is not someone performing calm over panic." She kept her voice even. "What I'm reading underneath it is the particular quality of someone who made a decision they believed was rational, and still believes it was rational, and is now primarily concerned with whether the consequences can be managed rather than with whether the action itself was wrong." A silence. "There is no guilt about Aldrich's condition," Isle continued. "There is calculation about outcomes. There is—" She paused, finding the edge of something. Frustration. Old, long-held frustration about what she was given and what she believed she was owed. And there is the specific tension of someone who knows that the story they have prepared is not going to hold. Vespera's hands, still folded on the table, did not move. Her face did not change. But her scent shifted in the way that things shifted when containment reached its limit, and Isle read it clearly and said nothing further because nothing further was needed. The Western alpha looked at Aldrich. "My lord, you are the injured party. What do you say?" Aldrich's voice was steady. "I say that I have been dying in my own hall for the better part of a year, and I did not understand why until the last few weeks." He did not look at Vespera. "I say that the Omega my Luna Queen exiled to the outer forest was the only person in my holding who tried to help me." A pause. "I say that this hearing is not a formality." The deliberation did not take long. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Vespera was stripped of her title and her standing, and sentenced to exile from all Pact territories under the Alpha King's jurisdiction, which was, effectively, exile from the Shifter World's recognized lands entirely. Her retinue was dismissed. Her advocate said nothing. She was escorted from the room without ceremony. She went without struggle, which Isle thought was the most honest thing she had seen from her. The recognition that the shape of her defeat had been determined before she entered the building, and that performing dignity in the face of it was the last thing available to her. Oswin was brought in after Vespera's departure. Calder addressed him briefly. The council had reviewed his conduct and found not active conspiracy, but the deliberate suppression of concerns that should have been raised. in service of a political position that had made him useful to Vespera's agenda without requiring him to know its full extent. He was removed from the council. He was not exiled. He left the room with the expression of a man who had survived something at a cost he had not yet fully calculated. Aldrich, before he was helped back to his quarters to rest after the strain of the morning, stopped beside Isle in the corridor. "Your gift," he said. "I imagine you've spent most of your life making yourself small enough that no one noticed it." "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Don't do that anymore." He said it without drama, the way he might have said any practical thing, and then he continued down the corridor with his guard. Petra found her an hour later in the courtyard, where Isle had gone because she needed air and space and the particular blankness that cold provided. "It's done," Petra said, standing beside her. "Yes. What happens now?" Isle looked out across the valley. The winter light was thin and clear, the kind that showed everything without softening any of it. "Calder wants to speak with me." "I know." Petra was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" It was the question Isle had been turning over for weeks, and she had arrived, somewhere between the hearing room and this courtyard, at the beginning of an answer. Not a complete one, but a beginning. "Time," she said, "to do this on my own terms." Petra made a small sound of satisfaction that was worth more to Isle than most other people's speeches. Calder found her that evening. He came to the courtyard without his beta, without his council face, without the architecture of the hearing day still around him. He looked like someone who had put down something heavy and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. He stood beside her for a moment before he spoke. "I'm not going to ask you to decide anything tonight," he said. "Or this week. Or on any timeline that comes from what I want, rather than what you need." Isle looked at him. In the fading light, his eyes were very green and direct, and the bond between them was warm and unhurried and entirely patient. The way it had been since the ruins, present without insisting. "I know that," she said. "I want you to know that I know what I'm asking. It's not a small thing. What you came from, what was done to you. I'm not asking you to set that aside." He paused. "I'm asking if you're willing to see what this becomes. Slowly, with full honesty on both sides." She considered him for a long moment, not reading him, not reaching for the gift, just looking at him the way you looked at something when you wanted to see it clearly, rather than usefully. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. Something in his expression settled, not with disappointment, but with the particular quality of a man who had expected no guarantees and found the answer fair. 3 weeks later, Petra was given a formal role in the court as the Alpha King's herbalist and medical counsel, a position that had been vacant for 2 years and that suited her with an exactness that felt less like appointment and more like correction of a long-standing error. She accepted it without ceremony and immediately began reorganizing the storage room in a way that alarmed the existing staff. Isle watched her from the doorway on a morning when the valley had its first clear sky in days, light spreading cold and bright across the stone. She was still there, not because the bond required it, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at the shape of the choice and found that staying was what she actually wanted. Calder's control fractured in the smallest, most dangerous way. He drew her close as if to shield her from the world, and his mouth found the vulnerable line where her pulse lived. His teeth grazed skin, barely pressure, barely a promise. Yet the bond answered like a snapped rope finally tied, heat rushing through both of them so fast it stole breath. He froze the instant he realized what he'd done. Not a bite, not a mark. But the instinct had spoken anyway, and Isle's hands tightened on him as if she'd felt the same word land in her bones. Spring was still months away. She found she was not in a hurry. And that is where we leave Isle and Calder. Not at a grand declaration, but at something quieter and more honest. A choice made freely, without debt or desperation. We watched Isle survive a forest meant to kill her, walk into a king's court as a fugitive, and leave it as the witness who dismantled a queen. We watched Petra travel half a kingdom alone with a bottle of poison and a copied ledger. And we watched Calder choose over and over to be someone worth trusting. What did you think? Was there a moment that stayed with you? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and your thoughts shape what comes next. If this was your kind of story, subscribe. There is more coming. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means everything. Until next time.